Hi. Recently, a group of investors raised a few queries on aspects of business where clarifications were due. So, what I'll attempt to do is to try and break up my talk now into four parts. One is how does one create value and sustain the same? Second, what is the importance of value for an organization? Third, what can be the capital composition for a business? And fourth, I'll touch upon a few metrics that would be appropriate for organizations at various points in the value chain. Coming back to value, interestingly, this is a discussion that has taken place across boards, across geographies. Uh, in my association with organizations in Southeast Asia, Pacific region, and here in the Middle East, this would be a topic that would be dwelt on uh, and to understand as to how one can hold stroke grow value of organizations. Rather than getting into an abstract discussion, let me try and pick certain quantitative information that's available in organizations. If you pick the P&L of an organization, the top two metrics, that is revenue and gross margin, go to determine value. By gross margin, what I mean is gross profit over revenue, a percentage of the same. If that particular gross margin is consistent over financial periods, say 3 to 4 years, that is good. Second, that particular gross margin, the higher it is, the greater is the value of the organization. Third, the revenue should also have a certain stable stroke firming up trend. And a combination of the two goes to provide value to the organization. So inherently, the value is naturally provided by the products and services that the concern offers, and it should be relevant, it should be comparative, and it should be deemed to be of a certain value. There is yet another aspect that goes to add to the value of the organization, and that falls in the governance space. I will touch upon this towards the end of this particular talk. What is the importance of value? Now let's look at it the other way around. If you take up an organization that operates on gross margins that are in single digits or lower, such organizations are typically in the commodity space, in the trading space, or they add very low value to the input products and services. This naturally means that they are in a comparative space and the ability to then grow the margins are limited. For such organizations to grow their value, the only strategic option available is to grow the top line revenue. Alternatively, they may seek to move up the value chain, but that's a whole different discussion. If revenue and volume growth happen to be the strategic initiatives that it has to go into, there is a commensurate impact on working capital because that also grows in requirement. There is a higher exposure to the market in terms of debtors. There is also a challenge related to price and future profits it can make linked to a falling market. And there are limitations to creating value for such organizations. I will touch upon certain aspects of this again towards the end of this presentation. I now come to an aspect that is capital composition. An interesting aspect is whenever an organization comes under pressure, the first port of call is the banker. They seek more liquidity support from the banks, and it adds on to their debt. Now, this happens because of the environment, There is a possible scenario where the revenues are under pressure. There's a drop in gross margins due to competitive pressure, or there's a growth in overhead costs which the organization is not able to contain. This impacts the cash flow, and the short-sighted solution typically is to then seek additional debt. It is very, very important for such organizations to have this rigorous exercise of determining the future financials, projecting the revenue margins of future periods and reviewing them same and proactively addressing challenges that may set in is very critical. That's part of governance. Certain metrics that it needs to have a tab on are, for example, EBITDA to short term debt. EBITDA is operating cash that comes into the organization. That should be greater than the short term debt settlement that the organization needs to effect. As I said earlier on, whenever there's a challenge, the first port of call is a banker. Various things tend to happen. There is a mix up between debt that is required for capital investment, debt that is required for managing your working capital requirements. So this mismatch is also widely prevalent. So the long-term debt to short-term debt is a metric that should be constantly measured. The numerator, that is long-term debt, should keep growing with a commensurate decline in short-term debt. That enhances the liquidity situation of the company. Mind you, while this is a challenging task, if one is organized, structured about this particular exercise, the banks listen and they do support such initiatives. The last part is the debt to equity ratio of the organization. The organization should be very cautious in terms of using these parameters to determine as to what is an affordable level of debt that it can carry in its books. The fundamental principle is it should be in a position to service this debt and not default. I now come to a certain specific review. For asset intensive organization, it's worth first looking at the turnover to asset relationship. I will share a certain experience I've had. Some years back, I chaired the board of the largest equipment rental and modular fabrication group in the region. There was an interesting observation. The group had embarked on a strategy to grow its value by investing in assets. So when it got into that particular mode, the revenue grew. The EBITDA was fairly stable. It grew at a lesser rate. But the challenge was the net margins were declining very sharply. So EBITDA trend and the net margin trend were diverse. They were moving in opposite directions. This could have potentially led to, into the future, a liquidity challenge. There we focused on enhancing productivity of existing assets. There were other initiatives, for example, going for leasing assets, then buying them outright. And a combination of such initiatives led to a correction, and the net margin trend and the EBITDA trend aligned with each other. We were able to grow the value of the organization by over 60%. So these are initiatives that actually are extremely beneficial, and one should keep this in mind when reviewing such organization. There are other aspects that one can look at. For example, in heavy engineering, where the gestation periods are long, and you have basically uh, project related work that goes on. Project financing is one possibility, which anyway organizations significantly resort to. There are other possibilities. Project related equity infusion, that is also possible. So one has to think innovatively to try and ensure that the liquidity situation is always favorable to the organization. I now come back to the earlier part wherein I had indicated that I'll share with you as to what else can go to growing the value of organizations. Consistency of financial information and reliability of the same is very, very important. Now, over a period of time, through various interventions and through various inputs that keep coming in, the allocation of certain expenses may move heads. Now, if this is a one off correction that happens and one is able to justify the same, it's fine. But periodic such changes create an element of instability and element of discomfort in valuation of the organization. And therefore, it's very important to be very consistent in terms of uh, providing of such information and ensuring that the frequency at which they are supposed to come are not gone away from. Strategic planning is very, very crucial. These days, we keep hearing of disruption to businesses. To me, disruption is akin to going in a car at a 120 km speed on a straight road and suddenly wanting to swear to the right because there is a turning that if I had missed, I would have probably then lost out on the place I wanted to go. If one is able to try and anticipate changes and start acting on the same, that to me is strategic thinking. Now, strategic thinking basically gets aided by various external sources also today. You have specialist consultants, you have specialist advisory, you get to see what's happening around you, you get to examine trends in your daily life, which you need to factor in addition to internal quantitative review of information to determine as to where the organization needs to go strategically into the future. And I again re-emphasize stability of the gross margin trend and consistent growth in revenue add up to determining the value of the organization. I'm happy to respond to any queries related to this particular talk, and I'm also happy to probably provide any other clarification that one may seek related to this or any other aspect of governance and corporate strategy. Thank you very much.